You're in the 14th century, Northern Europe. The wind cuts through your hut like knives. The ground is frozen, the snow piling high. No firewood left, no fireplace to relight. And without heat, your family won't see morning. This is Aldrich's world. A peasant, a father standing in a mud-walled house half buried in frost. Awe gives way to peril. If the fire dies, so does life. But Aldrich isn't helpless. He has a system clever, resilient, tested across generations. Tricks born of soil straw and sheer human grit. Heated stones hidden under beds. Walls that breathe warmth. Floors that trap cold beneath straw. Result survival, night after night, even in winters near 0.5 degrees. So the question is, were they primitive? Or are we the fragile ones now? Aldrich was no knight, no lord, just a peasant of the 14th century, living on the edge of survival in Northern Europe. His gray wool tunic hung heavy on his shoulders, worn thin at the elbows. Cracks ran along his hands from endless labor in the fields, each breath rising as a white cloud in the freezing air. Firewood was precious, reserved for the village's communal oven and the blacksmith's forge. For ordinary families, there was rarely enough left to burn inside their own homes. Winter demanded sacrifice, and without clever solutions, it could demand lives. Inside his earthen-walled hut, roofed with thatch and packed with moss, Aldrich faced the long months of cold, with no stack of logs to rely on. So how did Aldrich and his neighbors keep warm? Here are 7 forgotten tricks, vital then, and astonishing even now. In Aldrich's village, firewood wasn't for every home. It was rationed for the communal hearth, leaving families to survive the night with little more than mud and straw. His house looked fragile, but the walls, half a meter thick, were his first shield against the cold. Here's the secret thermal mass. Packed earth and straw behaved like a slow battery. By day, the clay absorbed heat from the hearth or the weak northern sun. At night, it bled that heat back into the room, turning bare dirt into a quiet source of warmth. Archaeologists in Northern Europe still find these huts standing proof the technique worked for centuries. How to gather clay-rich soil, chop straw for fibers, mix layer thick and tamp it hard, seal every crack with mud or moss. Mistake to avoid leaving gaps where the wind cuts through. The result was subtle but life-saving. Outside, the North Sea wind froze buckets of water solid. Inside, the earthen walls held just enough warmth to keep children breathing until dawn. No fuel burned, no wood spent, just soil, straw, and patience. Have you ever tested how well an earth wall can hold heat? Comment Earth if you'd like to see this trick built and tested in the field. When the firewood pile was gone, Aldrich still had one more source of heatstone. In the evening, he buried smooth river rocks deep into the embers of the dying fire. By the time the flames burned out, those stones glowed with hidden warmth. Here's the science: rock has a high specific heat capacity. That means it can absorb a lot of energy without cracking, then release it slowly through the night. Wrap it in coarse linen or wool, and you have a medieval heat battery safe enough to slip under blankets or place at your feet. It's the same principle modern survivalists use with hot water bottles in the wild. How to choose dense stones, rounded and dry. Heat them gradually in the coals, never in open flame, or they may shatter. Wrap in cloth, place at your core, or under bedding. Mistake to avoid using wet or layered rock, which can explode. The result: Aldrich's children slept with warm feet while the northern wind howled outside. A single stone properly heated could radiate comfort for hours without spending a stick of wood. It turned the hearth from a short blaze into an all-night companion. Would you trust a hot stone for warmth in freezing weather? Comment stone if you'd like to see this trick tested against modern hand warmers. When the frost was too deep and the fire too weak, Aldrich turned to the oldest heater of all living bodies. On the harshest nights, he let a few lambs or even a goat sleep inside the hut. Their breath steamed in the dark, and their warmth spread across the straw. Biology explains why it worked. Every animal produces heat just by living. A single sheep gives off as much warmth as a small space heater today, roughly 80 to 100 watts of constant energy. In a packed hut, that heat didn't vanish. It gathered, raising the temperature just enough to stop frostbite. How to bring in small animals on freezing nights. Spread clean straw so moisture doesn't build. Let them huddle near the family, but keep a barrier of cloth or hide to prevent mess. Mistake to avoid overcrowding, which brings damp air and disease. The result, Aldrich's children didn't shiver alone. They fell asleep to the soft bleating of lambs, the warmth of shared bodies seeping through layers of wool. It wasn't comfort by modern standards, but it was survival. In a winter hut, even a goat could be a lifeline. Would you ever share your shelter with animals to survive the night comment warmth if you'd try this medieval trick? Bare ground was the enemy of warmth. In Aldrich's hut, the frozen earth pulled heat from every body that lay upon it. The answer was simple but genius. A thick layer of straw spread like a golden carpet across the floor. Science confirms the wisdom. Straw traps pockets of air inside its hollow stems. Those tiny air chambers act as insulation, breaking the path of heat loss. In effect, Aldrich turned his dirt floor into a medieval sleeping pad, an early version of what campers today call a thermal barrier. How to gather dry straw at least a hand's breadth thick. Spread it evenly, then press down to remove gaps. Lay hides or wool blankets on top for comfort. Mistake to avoid using damp straw, which collapses insulation and invites mold. The result, instead of shivering on cold ground, Aldrich's family slept above a cushion that held warmth. The children could curl up like chicks in a nest safe from the frost creeping in below. One humble plant harvested from the fields became the difference between a freezing floor and a livable home. Would you build a straw floor for your survival shelter? Comment straw if you want us to field test this forgotten trick. The roof was more than shelter. It was the gatekeeper of warmth. A thatched roof of straw alone could breathe, but it could also betray letting icy winds slip through and steal the family's heat. Aldrich's answer was clay. By coating the thatch with a layer of mud and clay, he transformed a leaky lid into a shield against the storm. Why did it work? Straw bundles provided structure while clay filled the gaps, hardening into a crust when winter frost set in. This crust blocked drafts and slowed water from seeping through. In effect, it was medieval weatherproofing, an upgrade that turned simple straw into insulation. Modern science calls it reducing air infiltration. Peasants called it survival. How to first bind straw tight in overlapping layers. Then smear a slurry of clay and water across the surface. Let it dry in the autumn sun until it hardens. Mistake to avoid leaving thin patches which crack and invite leaks. The result was powerful. Even in North Sea gales, the wind could no longer whistle through the roof. Inside, Aldrich's family slept under a ceiling that breathed warmth instead of letting it escape. A roof that once sang with drafts now stood silent, keeping cold at bay. Would you try sealing a thatch roof with clay in your own survival build? Comment roof if you'd like us to test this forgotten trick against modern tents. Beneath Aldrich's floor lay a secret weapon fire that never died. When wood was scarce, he could not afford a blazing hearth all night. Instead, he dug shallow pits under the floor, filled them with glowing embers, and covered them with layers of ash and stone. The fire disappeared from sight, but the heat lingered. Why did it work? Ash acted like insulation, smothering oxygen while trapping heat. The stones absorbed warmth, then radiated it slowly upward through the straw floor. It was a primitive but effective heat battery, releasing energy for hours without visible flames. In modern terms, it was thermal banking. For Aldrich, it meant his children slept above a quiet furnace. How to dig pits no deeper than a hand's width. Place hot embers inside, cover with ash, then add flat stones on top. Lay straw or boards over as flooring. Mistake to avoid leaving embers exposed. They flare up, ignite straw, and turn warmth into wildfire. The result was astonishing. While the hut looked cold and lifeless, the floor itself radiated a steady, gentle heat. It wasn't enough to roast a feast, but it was enough to keep toes from freezing and families alive through endless winter nights. Would you risk sleeping above a hidden ember pit in your own survival shelter? Comment Ember if you want us to test this medieval floor heating trick today. The last trick wasn't inside Aldrich's hut. It was in the village itself. Fire was too precious to waste, so communities treated it as a shared lifeline. Instead of every family burning scarce wood, one central hearth, often in the longhouse or monastery kitchen, was kept alive day and night. From there, coals were carried in clay pots or horn containers to relight smaller stoves at home. It wasn't just practical, it was survival through cooperation. By pooling effort, the village cut fuel use, protected against fire accidents, and ensured that no family ever faced a frozen night alone. Imagine stepping into the longhouse after hours in the snow, the walls echoing with voices, the air thick with smoke and warmth, and in the center, a blaze that belonged to everyone. How to, medieval style, keep one large fire supervised, surrounded by stone. Designate firekeepers in monasteries, brothers who tended embers through prayer shifts. Transport coals in covered clay pots stuffed with moss or ash to retain heat. Mistake to avoid leaving fire transport open, which killed embers before reaching home. The result was a resilient network of heat. Even if Aldrich's household fire died, he could walk to the communal hearth and return with new life. In modern prepping terms, this was redundancy through community, a medieval mutual aid system. Would you rely on your neighbors for fire if it meant survival? Comment fire if you think modern preppers could learn from this medieval network. Look at the contrast. Today we flick a switch and a heater hums. We plug in an electric blanket and warmth flows from the socket. We buy silicone sealant to block drafts in seconds. But in the 14th century, warmth came from walls of packed earth, from the body heat of sheep, from moss stuffed into every crack. Different tools, same purpose. And here's the truth. What we call primitive was actually renewable, low cost, and sustainable. No electricity bill, no fuel shortage, just human ingenuity and natural materials. For Aldrich and his neighbors, survival wasn't wasteful, it was efficient. So the question is, in an age of high energy costs and climate strain, who's really more advanced, the medieval peasant? Or us? Morning breaks. Snow has buried half the door, but inside, Aldrich's family stirs to life, breath rising in the dim light, proof they made it through the night. No firewood was burned, no modern heater was needed. What kept them alive was knowledge passed down walls that stored heat straw, that trapped air animals that shared warmth. And here lies the lesson. Survival doesn't come from the gear you carry, it comes from the wisdom you remember. Tools may change, but principles endure. Now it's your turn. Which of these 7 tricks surprised you most? Drop it in the comments, I'd love to see your answer. And if you want more tested medieval survival knowledge, don't forget to subscribe. The next storm, whether in the 14th century or today, may come sooner than you think.